Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty heavy. We're going to be looking into the Grim Sleeper case.
Yeah, this one's really unsettling.
Um, you sent over a news article from People and the Wikipedia page. Looks like we've got a lot to cover.
Yeah, we do.
So the Grim Sleeper, right? This was a serial killer who operated in Los Angeles.
Right.
And one of the things that's just crazy is how long this went on for.
Yeah, the time frame is just unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking 1984 all the way to 2007.
That's a long time.
And then there's that eerie gap in there where the killings seem to stop.
Yeah, the so-called grim sleep, hence the nickname.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what was going on during those years, Was he really inactive, or were there just victims who were never found?
Just chilling to think about. So before we get into the specifics, I think it's important to lay out what we're going to focus on today.
Right, good idea.
So who were the victims?
Hmm.
How did Lonnie Franklin Jr., the guy who was eventually convicted, how did he manage to avoid getting caught for so long?
Yeah, that's a big one.
And what finally led to his arrest?
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning, the 1980s, when this all started.
Yeah, back to the 80s in L.A. And it's important to understand the context, right? This was during the crack epidemic.
Yeah, you had a lot of social upheaval, a lot of communities really struggling,
And the victims in this case were primarily young black women.
many of them struggling with addiction, involved in sex work.
Right. And that really plays into how the case was handled, at least initially. But before we get into that, let's talk about the crimes themselves.
Sure. So the People article and the Wikipedia entry both describe a pretty consistent modus operandi.
Modus operandi, so like a signature way of doing things.
Exactly. Most of the victims were shot, .25 caliber pistol.
Oh, specific.
Yeah, some were strangled, and their bodies were often found dumped in alleys and dumpsters,
God, that's awful.
along Western Avenue primarily.
And they were naked or partially clothed, right?
Right, just a real sense of dehumanization.
Yeah. It's horrific. And early on, the police thought they were dealing with one killer, the Southside Slayer.
Right, that was the theory. One guy targeting sex workers.
Makes sense, right. Seems like a pattern. But then it turned out to be more complicated than that.
Yeah, the Wikipedia article explains how investigators later realized there were actually multiple killers operating in the area at that time.
So multiple people preying on this vulnerable population, awful. And it brings us to the criticism that the LAPD faced.
Yeah, there was a lot of anger, a lot of accusations that the police weren't doing enough to solve these murders.
Because of who the victims were.
Exactly. There was this feeling that if these were, white women from more affluent backgrounds, there would have been a much bigger response.
And this wasn't just a feeling, right? There were people actively speaking out about this.
Oh, yeah. Margaret Prescott, she was a real force in the community, and the Black Coalition fighting back serial murders, they were putting a lot of pressure on the city to take this seriously.
Yeah, they even pushed the city council to increase the reward money.
Which they did eventually, but only up to $25,000. I mean, think about that.
Yeah, it's pretty telling, isn't it?
It is. So you had all these murders happening, this sense of fear and frustration in the community, and the police struggling to make any headway.
And then by the late 80s, they start to realize that maybe they're not dealing with just one killer.
Right. They're starting to see inconsistencies in the patterns, different descriptions of suspects. But there's still this one common thread.
The .25 caliber gun.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So even with the possibility of multiple perpetrators, you've got this cluster of murders linked by that same weapon.
And some of the earliest victims connected to that gun were Deborah Jackson in August 1985 and Henrietta Wright in August of 86, according to the Wikipedia timeline.
Right. And by 1987, they had linked 7 victims to that same firearm.
And that detail, that's going to come back in a big way later on. But first, we've got to talk about the period that gave this killer his name.
The grim sleep.
Right. After Alicia Monique Alexander was murdered in September of 88, things went quiet.
Eerily quiet. 14 years without another confirmed murder.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that. Did he just stop? Was he out there doing other things, maybe even killing other people who were never connected to him?
It's definitely a chilling thought. But then, in the early 2000s, the nightmare starts again.
Yeah, the murders resume, and this time, DNA technology is going to play a crucial role.
Right, you've got Princess Berthomieu in 2002, then Valerie McCorvey in 2003, and Janisha Peters in 2007. All linked through DNA and ballistics.
Through the same gun, same killer. And the LAPD, they put together a special task force.
The 800 task force, but this time, They're operating in secret.
Which is interesting, right? Why the secrecy?
Well, it was LA Weekly reporter Christine Polisek who broke the story.
Yeah, and she's the one who wrote that People article.
Exactly. So she reveals that the task force exists and that they've linked these new murders to the ones from the 80s.
And suddenly, this case that had gone cold for so long is back in the headlines.
Right, and it starts getting national attention. A $500,000 reward is offered.
It's featured on America's Most Wanted.
And that's when the police officially start using the name Grim Sleeper.
So it was the media that kind of coined that term, but the police adopted it.
Yeah. And they also release a 911 call from way back in the 80s.
What was that about?
A guy called in, said he saw someone dumping a body, even gave a description of the vehicle and a license plate number.
Wow, so a potential early lead.
Yeah, it's hard not to wonder if things could have been different if they'd followed up on that call more aggressively.
Right. Hindsight is always 20/20, but still. And then there's Anitra Washington.
The survivor. Her story is just incredible.
Absolutely. She was attacked, shot, sexually assaulted, and left for dead.
But she survived.
And she was able to give the police a description of the attacker and his vehicle.
Even after all those years, her testimony was crucial.
Yeah, it's amazing how much detail she could remember. But okay, let's get to how they finally caught this guy.
DNA.
Right, but there's a twist.
Yeah, frustrating one. It turns out that Lonnie Franklin Jr. had actually been in this system before.
He had.
Yeah, he had a felony conviction and was on probation.
So they should have had his DNA.
You'd think so. But there was this weird gap in the law back then. Proposition 69, which required DNA collection from all felons, had passed, but the rollout was slow.
Oh, wow, so he slipped through the cracks. Literally.
Basically. But then comes the break in the case. Franklin's son, Christopher, gets arrested for a weapons charge.
Okay.
And his DNA is entered into the database.
Mm-hmm.
It's a partial match to DNA from the crime scenes.
What does that mean, partial match?
It means it's not an exact match, but it's close enough to suggest a familial relationship, like father and son.
Wow, so they finally have a lead on Lonnie Franklin Jr.
Exactly. And to get a confirmed DNA sample, they get pretty creative.
Yeah, the undercover operation at the pizza place, it's like something out of a movie.
Right. They had an undercover officer posing as a busboy.
And they collected Franklin's discarded pizza crust, cups, a fork, even a slice of pizza he didn't finish.
And that's it. They got the DNA match.
Finally. And they arrest him on July 7, 2010.
It's the end of a very long and terrifying chapter for a lot of people.
But the investigation wasn't over. Not even close.
Right, because when they searched Franklin's house, they found something truly disturbing.
Hundreds of photos and videos of women.
Many of them nude, some unconscious.
It's like this whole other level of depravity.
It is. And the police decided to release some of these photos to the public.
Hoping someone might recognize the women and they could identify more victims.
Exactly. They were trying to piece together the full scope of what this guy had done.
And on top of the photos, they also found more physical evidence.
Jewelry, women's belongings, and most importantly, the gun.
The .25 caliber.
The one that had been used in all those murders.
There was one more really chilling find, right?
Yeah, the Polaroid photo of Anitra Washington.
In his garage.
Linking him directly to the survivor.
Wow. And they also found an ID card belonging to Ayala Marshall and a driver's license for Rolania Morris, both missing women.
Both last seen near Franklin's home. But unfortunately, their bodies were never found.
God, just awful. It really makes you think how many more victims there might be.
It does. So the trial finally starts in February of 2016.
Franklin's charged with 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder.
And in May of 2016, he's convicted on all counts.
Guilty. But then, during the sentencing phase, the prosecution brings up even more potential victims.
Sharon Alicia Dismuke, Inez Warren, Georgia May Thomas, Rolania Morris.
All women who they believe were killed by Franklin.
But they didn't formally charge him with those murders.
Why not?
They didn't want to prolong the trial any further. The families of the confirmed victims had already waited so long for justice.
Makes sense. So the jury recommends the death penalty.
And in August of 2016, he's formally sentenced to death.
But he doesn't die by lethal injection, right?
No, he died in his cell on death row at San Quentin in March of 2020.
They never release the cause of death, which just adds to the mystery of this whole thing.
It does. So we've talked a lot about the killer, but let's take a moment to remember the victims.
The women whose lives were cut short.
Sharon Alicia Dismuke, Deborah Ronette Jackson, Henrietta Wright,
Barbara Bassoon Ware, Bernita Rochelle Sparks, Mary Catherine Lowe,
Lacrica, Denise Jefferson, Inez Elizabeth Warren, Alicia Monique Alexander,
Princess Cheyenne Bartholomew, Valerie Louise McCorvey, Janisha Livette Peters, and of course, Anitra Washington, the woman who survived.
She's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that there might be others out there. Women whose photos were found in Franklin's house but who haven't been identified yet.
And then there's Thomas Sylvester Steele,
Who was that?
a suspected male victim. But they never actually charged Franklin with that murder.
And the missing women, Eileen Marshall and Rolania Morris, their cases are still unsolved.
That's heartbreaking to think about.
It is. And there's even a possibility that Franklin might be connected to other crimes beyond Los Angeles.
Yeah, the Wikipedia entry mentions that the police looked into whether he might have been the Belize Ripper.
Oh, wow.
He had connections to Belize, and the timeline kind of lined up.
But they never charged him with anything there.
No. And then there's the unsolved murder of Edwinta Hereford in 2010.
What happened there?
She was found dead near where Franklin dumped some of his victims.
So could be a connection.
Maybe, but the police haven't confirmed or denied it.
It's just crazy to think about how many lives this one man might have been responsible for.
It is. And the impact of this case goes beyond just the victims and their families. It's really captured the public's imagination.
Yeah, there have been documentaries, movies, books, all about the Grim Sleeper.
It's a story that just won't let go.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to reiterate the key takeaways.
Okay.
This case went on for decades.
Targeting vulnerable Black women.
And it highlights how important DNA technology is in solving these kinds of crimes.
And it leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions.
About how many victims there really were, about whether he was involved in other crimes, and about why it took so long to catch him.
Yeah, there's that quote from Regina Hall in the People article that really sticks with me. She called these crimes incredibly calculated.
And she talked about how Franklin understood the times and how he took advantage of the fact that these women weren't getting the attention they deserved.
It's a really powerful point.
It is. So I guess the question for our listeners is this. What does this case tell us about our society? About how we value different lives, about how we respond to violence, and about how we seek justice?
It's something we all need to think about, because it's not just about the Grim Sleeper. It's about making sure that all victims are seen and heard, and that their cases are given the priority they deserve.
Absolutely.
We can't let these kinds of tragedies happen again.
We can't. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.